Hi there, and welcome to this day in history for January 8th. January 8th is, of course, the 8th day of the year in the Gregorian calendar, with typically 357 days remaining until the end of the year, except in leap years, when there are 358 days remaining to the end of the year. This being a leap year, as I record in 2020, there are 358 days to the end of the year. Today's word is guesstimate or guesstimate. It's one of those blended words. As a verb, it means to make an estimate based on guesswork, and as a noun, it is an estimate based on guesswork. It's a blend of guess and estimate, and the earliest documented use is 1936. Now, I just want to remind you that links to my research are included in the show notes. So if you're curious about where I got this piece of information or that piece of information, check out those show notes. Also want to take a moment to ask you to smash that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And with that, I guess we'll carry on. We're going to start today in the year 1642, when astronomer Galileo died in Italy. He was 77 years old. He was born on February 15th of 1564, and I'm sure we'll mention him again that day. Galileo has been referred to as the father of modern astronomy, the father of modern physics, and the father of science, due to his revolutionary discoveries. He was the first person to use a telescope to observe the skies, and Galileo discovered the moons of Jupiter, the rings of Saturn, and sunspots, and the solar rotation. Galileo. On this day in 1790, George Washington delivered the first State of the Union address in New York City. In 1815, War of 1812 news. That War of 1812 went on for a bit, didn't it? Well, on this day was the Battle of New Orleans. Andrew Jackson led American forces to victory over the British. In 1828, the Democratic Party of the United States was organized. In 1835, for the first and only time, United States national debt reached zero. This was a pet project of President Andrew Jackson. He was one of these folks who believed that carrying debt is not a good thing to do, and so he worked real hard to reduce the United States debt and actually did get it down to zero. Unfortunately, like so many people, it seems the country didn't quite know how to operate without being in debt, and a bunch of problems ensued, followed by the Panic of 1837. A bank run and the subsequent depression tanked the U.S. economy and forced the federal government to begin borrowing again. And of course, the U.S. has been indebted ever since. The debt skyrocketed during the Civil War, but was nearly paid off by the early 20th century, only to balloon again with the onset of World War I. Numerous presidents and politicians and citizens have decried the debt and even pledged to do away with it, conservatives and libertarians frequently echoing Jackson's sentiments. Nevertheless, with the debt now surpassing $22 trillion, it is unlikely that the events of 1835 will be repeated in the foreseeable future. 1867, African American men were granted the right to vote in Washington, D.C. In 1877, Crazy Horse and his warriors fought their last battle against the United States cavalry at Wolf Mountain, Montana Territory. 1918, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson announced his 14 points for the aftermath of World War I. This was an address delivered before a joint meeting of Congress on January 8, 1918, during which Wilson outlined his vision for a stable, long-lasting peace in Europe, the Americas, and the rest of the world following World War I. On January 8, 1935, American singer, guitarist, and actor Elvis Presley was born. He would be 85 today were he still alive. Unfortunately, the king of rock and roll died in 1977 at the age of 42. 1940, some World War II news. Britain introduced food rationing. Times were hard in that war. Also in 1940, Mussolini questioned Hitler's plans. A message message from Benito Mussolini was forwarded to Adolf Hitler, in which he cautioned the Fuhrer against waging war against Britain. He wondered if it was really necessary to risk everything, including the regime, and to sacrifice the flower of German generations. Mussolini had an ulterior motive. At the time, Italy was not prepared to join the effort, and Germany would get all the glory and overshadow the dictator of Italy. Germany had already taken the Sudetenland and Poland. If Hitler took France and then pushed Britain into neutrality, or worse, defeated it in battle, Germany would rule Europe. Mussolini had assumed the reins of power in Italy long before Hitler had taken over in Germany, and in so doing, Mussolini boasted of refashioning a new Roman Empire out of an Italy that was still economically backward and militarily weak. He did not want to be outdone by this upstart Hitler. 1941, English actor and screenwriter Graham Chapman was born. He was one of the original members of Monty Python. Born on this date in 1941, he died in 1989 at the age of 48. On this day in 1942, English physicist and author Stephen Hawking was born. He was extremely intelligent, it goes without saying. He had a rare early onset and slow progressing form of motor neuron disease, MND, also known as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, a fatal neurodegenerative disease that results in the death of motor neurons in the brain and spinal cord and gradually paralyzes its victims, as it did him over the decades. Once he was diagnosed, no one expected him to live as long as he did. He lived to the age of 76, very unusual for people with that illness. Well, in 1946, Elvis Presley, for his birthday, received his first guitar. In competing versions of the story, what Elvis Presley really wanted for his birthday was a rifle or a bicycle, both fairly typical choices for a boy his age, growing up on the outskirts of Tupelo, Mississippi. But instead, Elvis's highly protective mother, Gladys, he said of her that she never let me out of her sight, she took him to the Tupelo hardware store and bought a gift that would change the course of history, a $6.95 guitar, on January 8, 1946, when Elvis Aaron Presley was 11 years old. 1959, Charles de Gaulle was proclaimed as the first president of the French Fifth Republic. On January 8, 1959, a triumphant Fidel Castro entered Havana, Cuba, having deposed the American-backed regime of General Batista. Castro's arrival in the Cuban capital marked a definitive victory for his 26th of July movement and the beginning of Castro's decades-long rule over the island nation. In 1963, Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa came to America and was exhibited in the United States for the first time at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson declared a war on poverty in the United States. In 1978, Harvey Milk became the first openly gay person elected to public office in California. He took his place on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors on January 8, 1978. The first and, for years, most visible openly gay politician in America, Milk was a longtime activist and pioneering leader of San Francisco's LGBT community. In 1981, a local farmer reported a UFO sighting in Aix-en-Provence, France. Don't know if I pronounced that correctly, not. And this sighting is claimed to be perhaps the most completely and carefully documented sighting of all time. I've placed a link to an article with more information about that in the show notes. 1982, the breakup of the Bell system. AT&T agreed to divest itself of 22 subdivisions. In 2002, President George W. Bush signed the No Child Left Behind Act into law. In 2016, the infamous drug lord known as El Chapo was captured by Mexican authorities. In the early hours of January 8, 2016, Mexican authorities apprehended the drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. It was the third time that the law caught up to El Chapo, a figure whose crimes, influence, and mystique rivaled those of Pablo Escobar. Interesting to note that he was held in the same prison facility in New York City in which Jeffrey Epstein met his demise, but I'm not going to say anything about that. And I think that's going to do it for us today. As always, links to my research are included in the show notes. Thanks for watching. Give it a like if you enjoyed this video. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. And feel free to share this video. While you're on the interwebs, check out my other channel, 8 Susquehanna. There's a link in the show notes to that as well. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Open wide. There, there's a little birdie on my front porch. Alrighty, back to work. Okie dokie, Smokey. Okay, that's all one long sentence. Alright, that's a lot of words. I don't know how to say that. Well, figure it out in editing. Some things just can't be done. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? She's not a man. See, this is what happens when we're not scripted. This is why I don't do live shows.